Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar about Varta's Central and Voluntary Register and donor linking. I'm Anna McLeod and I'm the CEO of the Victorian Assisted Reproductive Treatment Authority, but more easily referred to as Varta. I'm also joined by Claire McColl, Varta's Manager of Information and Donor Registry Services, and I'll introduce you to her in a moment. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we gather today, and I do pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, some of you have already submitted questions, and we will try and address these during the session today and at the end of the presentation. However, if you have any additional questions, you can type them into the Q&A function at any time, and we will endeavour to respond to them at the end of the session. I would, of course, it is with great pleasure, I would now like to introduce you to Claire McColl. Now, Claire originally joined us and our regulatory team around 2 years ago, but she's now working in the dual role of Information Manager and also the Donor Registry Services Manager, so hence her very long title. Now, Claire does have an extensive background in both regulation and information management in the public sector, and she's previously worked at Victoria Police, the Australian Building and Construction Commission, the Victorian Racing and Integrity Commission, and the United Nations. And that's just to name a few, but we're now going to go over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone to Varta's first webinar for 2022. The topic of this presentation is on Varta's Central and Voluntary Registers and donor linking. I'd like to thank, firstly, all of the Victorian ART clinics who expressed interest in learning more about Varta's role in this area, and also those fertility specialists and clinicians who've taken the time out today to join us from your busy roles. I'd also like to welcome those people who are joining us from other areas around Australia and overseas today, and I hope that you find the session beneficial. So today's presentation, we're going to cover a range of topics. So firstly, I'd just like to introduce you to our Information and Donor Registry Services team. We'll then start going into the Central and Voluntary Registers, and in particular have a look at what are they, what's the difference between the two registers. We'll cover some important legal and regulatory aspects, and then we'll have a talk about donor linking and what's involved in connecting people to their donor families, and what are some of Varta's experiences and findings in this area. And we'll finish the presentation by discussing some key challenges and opportunities for the future. And we'll leave some time aside at the end for any questions that any of you may have. So firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Varta's Information and Donor Registry Services team. So I'm Claire McColl, the manager of the team. We have two information officers, Carrie and Kath, and they're assisted by Beck. And we have 4 counsellors, Andrea, Lillian, Amelia, and Emily. And Emily's currently on maternity leave, and Amelia's with us on secondment, covering Emily for the time being. So I'd like to discuss what we do in the Information and Donor Registry Services team. So some of the key things that we do is firstly receiving birth notifications of any children born from donor conception in Victoria. We enter these into the Central Register, which we'll talk about shortly, and we also report all donor conceived births from treatment in Victoria to the Victorian Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages. We also provide advice, education and support to people involved in donor conception, and this includes people who are perhaps considering using a donor or becoming a donor themselves, and also those who've been through donor treatment and now have donor conceived families. We also receive and process applications from individuals for information from the Central and Voluntary Registers. We provide counselling to people who apply for identifying information from the registers, and this counselling covers information about their legal rights and responsibilities, but also the rights and responsibilities of those people that they're seeking information about. We also outreach and provide support to subjects of Central Register applications. And finally, we connect donor families through donor linking. So I'm now going to provide some information about the Central Register. So the Central Register is the Victorian Government's database of all births of donor-conceived people and people involved in assisted reproductive treatment using sperm, egg, or an embryo donor in Victoria. The register was first established in 1988, and today it holds the records of more than 32,000 people who are involved in donor conception in Victoria since the 1970s. Some of our earliest records include people who were involved in the very early days of donor treatment in Victoria at places such as Prince Henry's Institute of Medical Research, the Queen Victoria Hospital, and also the Royal Women's Hospital. These days, those who are recorded on the register come to us from birth notifications that doctors and the registered ART providers inform us about. Since the register came into effect in 1988, it's been managed by 4 different organisations or agencies in Victoria. So up until 1998, it was run by the Victorian Health Commission. Then from 1998 to 2010, it was run by the Infertility Treatment Authority. It was then taken over by the Victorian Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages up until 2017. And since March 2017, Varta have been the custodians of the Central Register. And it's a task that we take very, very seriously and with great responsibility for future generations of donor-conceived people and their families. So one of the things that hopefully will become apparent throughout this presentation is that there are some key differences between the Central Register and the Voluntary Register. And the first key difference, I guess, is who is able to be recorded in the registers. The other differences involve what information is recorded about people and also what can be disclosed from each of the registers. So with the Central Register, there are 3 different, I guess, parties who are recorded. Firstly, the donor-conceived child or children, the woman who received treatment and their partner, if they have a partner, and also details about the egg, sperm, and/or embryo donor. Sorry, I've hit a button. Yeah. There we go. So we also record information about the relationships between people who are recorded in the register, and this is really crucial information for us to keep track of the genetic relationships between the family members, and then also who is part of just a standard part of the general standard family. So one of the important things is how do people get recorded on the register. So the most important thing is that the donor treatment must have occurred in Victoria. If a patient had treatment in Victoria and then subsequently moved interstate or overseas, and the birth occurred interstate or overseas, that information still needs to be reported back to Varta so that we can record it in the Central Register. However, if a patient received treatment interstate or overseas, and then the actual birth occurred in Victoria, they're not eligible to be recorded on the Central Register. Similarly, if gametes or embryos are transferred interstate or overseas and treatment occurred there, they're also not eligible to be recorded on the Central Register. Once a child is born from donor conception, clinics notify Varta so that we can then upload their details on the register. At this time, we also inform the Victorian Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages that the birth has occurred. Varta then sends letters to the parents notifying them that themselves and the child has now been added to the register. And at the time, we provide them with some information about Varta services and some information about their rights and responsibilities. And we also let them know that they can apply to the Central and Voluntary Registers. In the past, we've also sent letters to donors each time they've had a new donor offspring. However, we've encountered some issues with this, particularly due to some sensitivities when the donor's partner finds that they've had a child. So for the past 6 months or so, we've stopped sending letters to donors each time they have a new donor offspring. And we now ask that the donors check with their clinics to let them know if they've had another child born. Alternatively, they can also apply to the Central Register for this information. So what information is recorded about donor conceived people, parents and donors on the Central Register? The ART legislation specifies exactly what information has to be recorded for each person. And this includes the person's names, dates of birth, their contact details. So for example, their addresses, postal addresses, email addresses, details of their treatment and where the child was born. We also record information about a person's gender. In the case of donors, we also record information about their physical features, their professional and family background, any interests and hobbies, as well as any medical conditions or genetic abnormalities that they may have. And all of this information is obtained either through the birth notifications and also particularly for the donors, it comes to us from some of the consent forms that the donors complete at the clinics when they consent to donor treatment. The information highlighted here is what is considered to be identifying information, and the information at the bottom is considered non-identifying information. And this breakdown of information determines what we can release to people depending on what they apply when they apply to the Central Register. So next we'll have a look at who can apply for information from the Central Register. So there are 4 different parties who can apply for information. So we have donors, parents, donor conceived people, and also the descendants of donor conceived people. Donors are able to apply for information just about their own donor conceived offspring, whereas parents, donor conceived people and descendants of donor conceived people can all apply for information about the donor or the donors. Parents and donor conceived people can also apply for information about donor siblings. Now, interestingly, all of the information, with the exception of information about donor siblings, people can apply for either identifying or non-identifying information. And this has, I guess, some serious ramifications for people who apply to the registers. You'll see that in some cases, the information is fairly one-directional. So what this means is that donor-conceived people, while they can find out how many donor siblings they may have, and maybe their gender and year of birth, they can't find out from the Central Register the names and identities of their donor siblings. And in the same way, the parents can't find out that information as well. In addition, parents aren't able to find out the identity of other parents who've used the same donor through the Central Register. So that's also an important thing to be aware of. So next, we're going to have a look at what's involved in processing an application to the Central Register. And this slide provides a general overview of the steps that our information officers and counsellors go through when we receive an application. So we'll firstly take receipt of the application from the person. If they're applying for identifying information, we have to offer the person a mandatory counselling session where they receive information and support about what they're applying for. So there's a number of important legal requirements that they need to be informed about, which we cover during this session. And we also, during this mandatory counselling session, cover points such as what are the implications of proceeding with the application, and cover some different outcomes that might occur. We then get the person to prepare what we call a statement of reasons, which is usually a 1 or 2 page letter or a document where they outline what their motivations are for applying to the Central Register and what information they would like to convey to the applicant so that they can then consider whether to release their identifying information or not. Once the applicant's completed the statement of reasons, Varta then sets about searching for the subject of the application. Sometimes this can actually be quite a time-consuming process, particularly where we may not have had contact with the person before, or we're relying on treatment records that might have been from the 1970s or 80s. And as you would imagine, people move house a number of times, might move interstate or overseas. We even have now some donors that people are searching for, so we have to contact overseas locations, trying to locate donors, and there's language barriers and a whole range of things. So we go to a lot of trouble to search, and we use publicly available sources to find people, and also to verify that they are the correct person. When we locate somebody, our counsellors then outreach to that person. Now, if the application is from a donor and they're searching for their donor offspring, and maybe some of them might be under the age of 18, in that case, we will outreach to the parents and seek consent from the parents or the guardians to provide consent for the release of the identifying information about the child. If the child is over 18, then legally we're required to outreach directly to the child. And as you would imagine, this can be quite complicated, particularly if the child hasn't been informed that they're donor conceived. And I'll touch on this a bit later on during the presentation. We have, in some cases, we have only 4 months from the date of the application to actually locate and notify a person that an application has been made about them. In other cases, there's no time limit for how long this may take. Once a subject responds to Varta, depending on who they are, we may give them, we can give them a couple of different options so they can decide whether or not to release their identifying information. In the case of donors, they don't have an option. It's mandatory that we have to release the identifying information if the applicant is a donor conceived person or a descendant of a donor conceived person. Whereas if it's a parent applying, the donor does have the option of not releasing their identifying information. So that's something to be aware of. Once the decision's been made about whether or not to release information, we also provide people the option of either lodging a contact preference or to participate in donor linking. Contact preferences are a very formal and legally binding process, and they essentially allow a person, such as a donor conceived person, to specify that they do not want contact with their donor, and the donor then has to sign an undertaking that they will comply with the contact preference. And if there is a breach of the contact preference, Varta can impose fines of almost $10,000 for if somebody doesn't comply with that contact preference. Other options in a contact preference might include that the person does want contact, but only through a certain method, such as through an email address or an exchange through a Varta counsellor. And the final step in the process is the disclosure of information. So we'll have a look at what that looks like. So this is an example. It's been de-identified, and yeah, it doesn't reflect a genuine case. However, this is an example of what the disclosure of non-identifying information might look like from the Central Register. So in this case, this is about a donor. So you can see that we disclose all of the information that is non-identifying about the donor. Occasionally, we have to be a little bit careful if the person has an occupation that would narrow them down and be someone that was very easy to find through that occupation. So we do have a little bit of flexibility about what we disclose, but we do have to be careful. With the disclosure of non-identifying information, we can do this without actually seeking the consent of the person who the application is about. This next one is an example of one of our information releases where someone has requested identifying information, and you can see there that they get their name, donor code, date of birth, contact details. If they've lodged a contact preference, we don't, and they've indicated no contact, then we won't provide any of the contact details for that person. And finally, if a donor asks for non-identifying information about their donor offspring, or parents and donor conceived people seek non-identifying information about their donor siblings, this is the type of letter that they will receive, indicating how many women were treated and then how many either donor siblings or offspring were born to that woman. And you can see it's just fairly general information. But occasionally we do find, unfortunately, that maybe one of the donor siblings or offspring is deceased, so we will actually notify them through that letter. So we'll move on now to the Voluntary Register. And I guess I've just got a couple of points to cover here. So while the Central Register is mandatory and includes all of the people involved in donor treatment in Victoria since the 1970s, the Voluntary Register is voluntary and is an option for people and families involved in donor treatment to share information in a less formal way and connect with each other. So while the Central Register has just over 32,000 records, the Voluntary Register is quite small in comparison. And at the moment, it just holds over 1,000 names. The Voluntary Register was established at a time when the treatment records of pre-88 donors and donor families weren't actually allowed to be entered on the Central Register. And so for those people, it was the only way that they could actually register their interest to connect with other people that they may have maybe family members with. Later on in 2014 and 16, there were some changes to the legislation, and that meant that those people who had treatment prior to 1988 were actually now allowed to be recorded on the Central Register. So in a way that reduced the importance of the Voluntary Register, and I think that's why it has stayed a reasonably small size. However, as I mentioned earlier, the Voluntary Register is actually the only way that donor-conceived people, if they register, can actually learn the identity of their donor siblings. And it's also the only way for parents of donor-conceived people to meet other parents who use the same donor. The Voluntary Register also allows people to share information about themselves on a much broader range of topics. So let's take a look at who is recorded on the register. Okay, so you'll see that it's the same parties who were able to be recorded on the Central Register. However, in addition, we have the descendants of donor-conceived people and also relatives of any person who's involved in donor treatment, which is quite interesting. To date, we've only had about 4 or 5 applications from relatives of people involved in donor treatment apply to the register. So in terms of what's recorded on the Voluntary Register, the only mandatory information is the person's name and contact details. We also record the donor ID, which you'll see in a moment helps us to connect people. But essentially, anyone is able to lodge on the Voluntary Register any information about themselves that they would like to share with others. So it could be they might want to lodge some letters, photographs, maybe a family tree. They can provide information about what their interests and hobbies are. And also it's a great way of sharing details about somebody if they've got a medical condition, particularly for donor-conceived people that want to share that with other siblings. On the register, we also record information about what a person's wishes are in terms of who they want to connect with and exactly what information they would like to share. So in terms of what's involved in processing a Voluntary Register application, what we look at in particular is the donor code that each person has in common. So in this particular example, we have a sperm donor with a donor code of A1, and they have four donor families. Now, any party from those families, including the donor and any of their relatives, can apply to the voluntary register. So the very first time somebody applies to the voluntary register, essentially they will have a no match because there's nobody else on the register with the same donor code as them or that was involved in the treatment. When another person applies, we then have a match. And at this point, Varta will contact both parties. And if they want to share identifying information with each other, we also have to provide them with a counselling session, again, to inform them of the implications of what's involved in sharing information with each other and any legal rights and responsibilities. If another person applies to the register, again, it's another match. And as you would imagine, as more and more people match, that means more and more letters and contacts from Varta. So in this example, we have 6 people who all share the same donor code, who've applied to the voluntary register. And that entails 15 different relationships that Varta has to manage. Sometimes certain parties don't want to connect with each other. Other times, people are very keen to connect with all parties. And so it's quite a lot to manage. And I think late last year we had, an 8th person or 8th or 9th person applied to the register. And as you can imagine, the work involved in processing these applications becomes quite exponential after a while. I'd now like to talk about donor linking. So you'd probably imagine that a lot of the work that Varta does in processing the Central Register and Voluntary Register applications is actually all donor linking, which is certainly true to an extent. However, in strictly legal terms, donor linking involves making connections between people through either the exchange of information or correspondence. So donor linking is available to again, all of those same people who could make a voluntary register application. They can also, you can do donor linking whether you've put in a central register application or a voluntary register application. And Varta does donor linking in 2 different ways. We either exchange information, so we have a facilitated mailbox where we'll exchange up to 5 items with people, but we'll only do this for the first 6 months because, as you would imagine, with that many relationships for us to manage, we can only do this for a limited period of time. After that time, we encourage people to set up maybe a Gmail account or some sort of a non-identifying email address if they wish to continue corresponding but don't want their identities to be known by the other party. Varta also arranges contact between the people, so we can assist them to exchange email addresses and phone numbers, and we can even set up a facilitated meeting between the parties as well. So just as a recap between the difference between the central and voluntary registers, so one of the really key things to keep note of is that the central register only stores information about donor conceived people, parents and donors, whereas the voluntary register also stores information about descendants of donor conceived people and relatives of any of those different groups of people. The other key difference is what information is available on the Central Register compared to the Voluntary Register. And I think by now you'll see that the Central Register is very tightly prescribed by the legislation about who can request information about who, and then exactly what information can be provided from the registers. Whereas with the Voluntary Register, it's much more flexible, and a whole range of different people can share information with each other. They can connect and choose what they share with each other. There's also some other important differences which I'll let you have a read through. But note in particular that the Central Register attracts a fee for each application, whereas the Voluntary Register is free of charge. So I'd now like to move on to some of the findings that we're making with the registers. So since Varta started managing the registers in 2017, the number of applications stayed reasonably stable at around 180 a year across the two registers. However, in 2021, we've seen a 50% increase in applications to the Voluntary Register, and at the same time, around a 13% decrease in applications to the Central Register. And the most interesting change over this time is who's applying to the registers. So over time, we've seen a steady decrease in applications to the Central Register from both donors and donor-conceived people. At the same time, we've had a sharp increase in parents making applications, particularly to the Voluntary Register, to the point now where in 2021, parents accounted for more than half of the applications to the Central and Voluntary Registers. Varta has observed that many of the parents who are applying to the registers have very young children, and quite a few are single parents. Anecdotally, we think that there's a number of reasons for this change. The Voluntary Register applications are less formal and don't require the same level of consents and legal undertakings as the Central Register. Parents are wanting to get to know other parents who use the same donor. Donor-conceived people are wanting the opportunity to learn the identities and connect with their donor siblings. And as I mentioned previously, this option isn't available with the Central Register. And also we're finding that donors want to connect with donor-conceived children who know that they're donor-conceived and are open to connecting with them and their donor families. The timing of this change also coincides with COVID-19, so that may also be a factor in more people wanting to connect via the Voluntary Register. We haven't necessarily heard that the having to pay a fee for the Central Register is a particular deterrent to applying. So I'd now like to go over some of the challenges and opportunities that we're seeing at Varta. So firstly, a large part of Varta's, the work of Varta's counsellors is to educate people about what to expect when they make an application to the registers and managing their expectations. So for many people, being introduced to their donor or donor families is an extremely rewarding experience and can answer a lot of questions and fill a major gap in their identity. However, for others, it can be very traumatic and a life-changing experience. And it can place a high toll on those individuals and their family members and those that are close to them. The most difficult work that the Varta counsellors do is outreaching to donor-conceived people who were born prior to 1998. In our experience, 90% of this cohort have not been told that they were donor-conceived. Many of these people are now in their mid to late 30s and 40s, and when Varta outreaches to them, it's extremely difficult for them to learn for the first time that they were donor conceived. It also affects their parents who feel that their secret has now been told. An application from a donor conceived person born during this period can also be quite traumatic for the donors as well, who were, at the time they donated, were guaranteed anonymity. And it's particularly traumatic for them if they've not told their partners that they were donors, and if they've got biological children of their own and they haven't told them that they donated. So Varta provides short-term counselling and support to these individuals and their families while we're processing their applications. However, we're not able to provide long-term therapeutic support to these family members. So this is why we're seeking to grow our network of external referral services so that we can provide individuals and families with an avenue so that they can get the long-term emotional and psychological support that they may need. Sometimes once parties connect through donor linking, the relationships don't always turn out as they expected. Sometimes the donors or one of the parties don't want to have contact, and this can be quite disappointing for the other party. Very occasionally, the relationship goes too well, with recipients entering into a relationship with the donor. This can cause some complex issues if the relationship ends, and is one of the reasons why our counsellors encourage our clients to set boundaries. With the increase in parents applying to the registers, especially new mothers, we're finding that some are disappointed when their donor doesn't want to release their identity or have contact with them after the child is born. We've had several reports from parents who've indicated that on the clinic donor profile that the donor would be open to contact, but when it's actually come down to it and they've applied to the register, they've discovered that the donor isn't interested. And Varta's now having to manage the fallout from this apparent rejection, and encourages clinics to really question donors during their initial counselling sessions about their openness to contact. And if they have any doubt, perhaps don't list it on the donor's profile that they're open to contact. Donors are also often quite surprised by how early parents want to know their identity and have contact with them. And many expected not to have contact until the child turned 18. And interestingly, we're now finding that parents are applying to the register when the children are really quite young, either as babies or toddlers. And we've even had a couple of applications recently from mothers who are pregnant, and therefore it's a bit too soon to be eligible to apply to the register. We certainly don't want to suppress the enthusiasm of these new parents who are applying to the registers, and we actually see it as a success of the legislation and a sign that it's no longer a taboo to talk openly about donor conception and to want to connect. And we hope that the experience of people involved in donor conception in Victoria today will be a much more positive experience than for those who were involved in donor conception before the legislation and when they weren't told. Varta places really large importance on telling children and early that they were donor conceived. And for those who are interested, I encourage you to watch our Time to Tell webinar, which is available on our website. I'll now move on to DNA testing. DNA testing is something that's really interesting for Varta, and we're finding that more and more people are learning that they were donor conceived as a result of having an external DNA test. Something as innocent as giving someone, say a family member, a DNA test for Christmas can actually turn out to be life-changing, as we discovered when a lady approached us last year. She was in her 60s and had just learnt that she was donor conceived. DNA testing makes it almost impossible to hide from your genetic heritage, and it's more and more likely that the information will eventually come out. And it highlights to Varta the importance of being open and telling children and adults that they were donor conceived, no matter what age they are. Despite the trauma, those that have been through the experience still report that they would have preferred to know that they were donor conceived than not at all. And they want the opportunity to meet with their donor before it's too late, which is a very real possibility because some of the donors are now aged in their 80s. And in particular, the donor conceived people want the opportunity to connect with their donor siblings. And Varta has a range of resources and support available to help parents go through this process of telling either children or adults that they were donor conceived. In terms of unregulated donor activity, I just want to touch on this briefly, but it's something that Varta is becoming increasingly concerned about with the number of consumers and donors who are taking up informal donations. While it may be less expensive than using a registered ART clinic, there's a range of health and legal risks that people open themselves up to if they go down this path. When someone chooses artificial insemination using a donor outside a clinic, the children aren't eligible to be recorded on the Central Register, which for those children, it means that they'll never know that they were their siblings, and they may never know the identity of their donor. In the next couple of months, there's also some changes coming to our legislation, which I'll just touch on very quickly in terms of notices of separation. When partners or parents separate during treatment, whether they may have gametes and embryos in storage or they're actually going through treatment, those parents are now going to be required to provide the clinics with a notice of separation, and that will essentially mean that the parties will have to reconsent to that treatment. And if they decide to continue with the treatment once they've separated, it means that the partner who's actually providing the gametes will need to be effectively regarded as a donor. And this will mean that the clinic will have to do all the reporting and comply with the birth notification and registering that child on the Central Register, which will be quite a change. And one implication may be that we do have a couple of clinics in Victoria who don't do donor treatment, and they may find that if they have couples who separate during treatment who still want to proceed, they may find themselves that they're in a situation where they're having to enter into the realm of donor treatment. And finally, I just want to mention a couple of things with the voluntary register. So we've seen a bit of a shift in how the register's been used over the years, and particularly from a place where people involved in early treatment could connect. We're now seeing it more with parents and donor siblings connecting. Varta wants to find ways to potentially manage the growth of the register, and we'll be seeking technical and technological solutions to try to find ways that we can make that register sustainable. We can see that there's a lot of benefits in the register, particularly for donor conceived people being able to connect with their siblings, and also potentially donors who may not want to cause any trauma for their donor conceived offspring to be registered on the voluntary register and wait for their offspring to apply, and be able to meet them at a point where they know they're donor conceived and willing to have that contact. At the same time, the voluntary register is still also a good place for people such as parents to meet other parents, and for those few people who don't have formal treatment records that are recorded on the Central Register. Over the next 6 months, Varta is going to be updating its IT systems that host the Central and Voluntary Registers, and we would like in particular to thank the Victorian Department of Health who provided the support and funding to enable us to do that. So thank you. And we'll now see if anybody has any questions.
Yes, great. Thank you. That's fantastic, Claire. Thank you for such an informative and interesting presentation. I'd always, it is such a complex area, and you know, since I started working here, it's just amazing, you know, how important it is that we get it right, the information right, and it's an enormous and important responsibility, which we feel a real privilege that we can look after and be the custodians of the database to collect this and to do the donor linking work, which is so important. So I do have a number of questions, and so Claire, you don't have to read. I can read them out to you, but I think some of them are just information that you've given, and it just needs a little bit of further clarification. So the first is, when you outreach, do you do it by letter or phone, or is there another methodology that you use when you do an outreach?
Yeah, so our preferred method is to do it by letter, and we do it by registered post. And that's just to ensure that the person who we correspond with, we want to make sure that it's them who opens that letter and not somebody else. Our initial letters are fairly generic, so we don't in those letters say you were donor conceived or give anything away. It's a generic letter that encourages people to contact Varta because we have some important information that we'd like to discuss with them. If we can't get a current address for somebody, then we may have to seek other options. Our least preferred method would be to use Facebook or some form of social media to contact people, but we have on occasion had to do this where necessary.
Thanks, Claire. The next question actually I can answer. It's just a request and a clarification about whether Varta will be moving to utilise more non-gendering language, and I can assure you that we are attempting over time as we update information on our website and through fact sheets, etc. We are trying to convert our language and be respectful of meeting the needs of all people. The next question is about donor siblings who are under 18, and can they have access to each other?
Yep, so they can apply to the voluntary register. There's no limit on what age a person can be with the voluntary register. Whereas with the Central Register, you can apply as a child, but you have to be considered to be sufficiently mature to apply. Whereas with the Voluntary Register, you can apply no matter what age you are.
Fantastic. It's sort of like a Gillick's competency test in when we doctors and nurses give care to people under 18. Now, this question, again, it might be a clarification for you to clarify, Claire. It's about, are donors aware that their identifying information could be shared amongst families on the voluntary register without their knowledge, even with children much younger than 18?
Yeah, it is a challenge with controlling what information is shared on the voluntary register. So really, once we introduce parties with another party, the information that they share is not something that we can control from that point onwards. So I guess the key thing is, yeah, people being informed about what information is available and what's out there and what can be discovered.
Right. The next one is about what are the counselling, what's mandatory in terms of counselling, because not all counselling is mandatory. So what's mandatory counselling and who pays for that?
Yep, so the counselling is provided by Varta, and it's free of charge. It doesn't cost anything for the applicant, but we cover a range of points during those counselling sessions. There's a number of what we call prescribed matters, legal rights and responsibilities that we need to inform the applicant about and make sure that they're aware of those. Things such as contact preferences, undertakings, and the different implications of those things. And we also cover, what people might expect, the different scenarios that may come out of their application, and prepare people for the possibility that maybe a person that they're applying for information about might even have been deceased. We may not be able to locate them, and they may not want contact. So we prepare them for all different range of possibilities. But it's provided free of charge by Varta.
Right. Claire, the next questions, and there's actually two questions around international donors. One, and so I thought maybe we could deal with them together as we're becoming short of time. One is, as international donors become more prevalent, once they're approved for usage in Victoria, will they be on the registry?
Yes.
Yes, and the next part was then, if we're looking for someone internationally, how do we go about doing this and verifying their identity?
Yeah, so I guess the best, when we're trying to locate international donors, we treat it in the same way that we do with anybody in Australia. So we usually start with the information about the donor that the clinic's provided to us. And so we'll try to contact them at their last known point of contact. If we can't find them there, we'll contact the overseas company that manages the donors, and we'll see if there's any up-to-date details there. And if we still can't locate them at that point, we'll then start doing some of our open source searches and try to locate them that way.
Fantastic. I've still got a couple more, and we've only got about 1 minute to go, so I'm not going to be able to ask all of them. I will ask about a question. I think this is very important, in that if a clinic submits a 20-week pregnancy recipient donor report, is that what goes on the central registry, or is that just for donor tracking, i.e. the family limit? Could you explain that, Claire? Because I think that's really important to us.
Yeah, so with the 20-week notifications, we start putting those entries on the central register, but we mark them, I guess, as a pending application. And we do at that point start looking at those donors and the family limits, and trying to see, just monitor whether how close that donor is getting to the 10 family limit. So
right. Excellent. I think we might have to wrap that up. I think one question which we do get asked a lot, so one absolute last question is, does Varta automatically contact the donor conceived person at 18 years of age?
No, we don't. No.
So only if they reach out.
Yes. That's right.
Great, thank you. I know there were some more questions. I'm so sorry we didn't get to answer them, but it's been a really popular topic. This will be available on our website, so just give us, it might be a couple of days or up to a week, I'm not sure, but I'm so grateful today to Claire for answering and giving us all your time and expertise, and also for those behind the scenes managing all that IT connection. So Renee and Beck, thank you. I just think that the team, you know, at Varta, we just think this is such an important area, and we wanted to share this information with you. So we are going to send out a feedback form after this, so it will pop up in your browser or on whatever platform you're on, and it will ask for feedback. We're so grateful if you could take the time to do that, because it's really important for us. We want to share information, we want to share our insights, and we want to hear from you and your point of view. So thank you very much, and please fill that in, and also tell us about what future topics you might like from us. That helps us be responsive to the industry needs, and it helps improve everybody's insights. So thank you. That brings us to the end, and thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.